Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today. My name is May Sepon, the Vice President of Global and Domestic Programs here at Cal-Asian Pacific Chamber of Commerce. The Chamber was founded in 2010 to give a voice to the over 600,000 AAPI-owned businesses in California. We are the largest statewide ethnic chamber in the state. Our mission is to grow and strengthen the AAPI business community. And one of the ways we're achieving this is through this virtual training event. This series is part of our AAPI Strong California efforts. I would like to take a moment to thank our sponsors who have helped us to make this series possible. The support of our sponsors is critical to the work we do, so a heartfelt thanks to Verizon, East West Bank, PG&E, and EASE. We also have a special message from East West Bank, which I'd like to share with you right now.
Hi, I'm Dorothy Chan, Community Development Manager at East West Bank. Supporting AAPI small businesses is one of our core focus because we understand their role in helping the local communities thrive. Unfortunately, they have been hit especially hard during the pandemic due to the rise in anti-Asian hate and violence. As a sponsor of the Cal-Asian Chamber of Commerce AAPI Strong California program, this project will provide the tools they need to speak up, protect themselves, combat bias, harassment, and violence. So as we emerge from this pandemic together, we will emerge AAPI Strong.
Thank you to East West Bank, as well as Verizon, EASE, and PG&E for all of the efforts and support provided to this wonderful program that we have for you. I know you'll learn a lot, so without further ado, the floor is yours, Elizabeth.
Thank you, May. I appreciate your words. Hello, everyone. Again, welcome, welcome, welcome. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Elizabeth Coleman, the Program Manager for the AAPI Strong California program at the California Asian Pacific Chamber of Commerce. And today I will be moderating this live training on protecting Asian lives, Asian American footprints, and cross-cultural sensitivity. Before we dive any further, I'd like to take some time to introduce the AAPI Strong California program. This program is a part of the National AAPI Strong Initiative led by the National Asian Pacific Islander American Chamber of Commerce and Entrepreneurship, also known as National ACE. Together with our corporate and nonprofit partners, we are standing against the racial bias, the discrimination, and the fear that has plagued the AAPI community, including our AAPI small business owners. And how do we do that? How are we building up the community? Through AAPI Strong California, the Cal-Asian Chamber of Commerce will be activating programs that strengthen the AAPI small businesses through the delivery of capacity building services like this training, technical assistance, data collection, and advocacy efforts. Now, before we begin, I would like to go over a bit of housekeeping notes. Today's session is being recorded and will be distributed for viewing post-conference. If you have any questions for the facilitator, please use the Q&A below in your Zoom toolbar. We will hold off on answering questions until the end of the presentation. We will then read them out loud for our expert to answer as time permits. If you have any technical questions, please reach out directly to me via the chat function. And we also invite you to participate in our AAPI Strong California survey that will be prompted at the very end of today's session. If you have any follow-up questions, please contact me at emerced@calasiancc.org. And now I am happy to introduce today's training and our facilitator, Hannah Lee. This training aims to provide a broad overview of the Asian American history, current anti-Asian hate crimes, and introduce effective ways toward restorative justice in the face of race-based discrimination and cross-community allyship. Our facilitator for today is an expert in developing curriculum and providing training on racial equity, mentorship, immigrant stress, and Asian American mental health for several for- and nonprofit organizations. Hannah has published and spoken at local and national conferences on these topics and has also served on the board of Korean American Coalition, a national nonprofit, and currently serves as the expansion coordinator for the Division of Students for the Asian American Psychological Association, which makes her well suited for today's training. Everyone, please join me in welcoming Hannah Lee. The stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Hi, everyone. I know we're unable to see our faces, but I am so honored and glad to be sharing this space with you all. I wanted to say hi, and I wish that I could see y'all's faces, but I'm joining you and really in a lot of gratitude and honor. Okay, so Janice, if you can go to the next slide for me, thank you. So before we kind of go into all the things that we're going to be talking about, and there's going to be some time reserved to be hearing from you all as well, but as we engage in this content and engage in the conversation that we're having today about Asian American current events and history, as well as hopefully tips that will be helpful to you all in kind of the hate crimes and a lot of the oppression that we have been experiencing more recently, but some things that have been kind of embedded within our system. There will be moments where it will feel pretty overwhelming, and there will be some spaces, I think, that are emotional and mentally really challenging. And so, right, these are really difficult conversations to have. And I wanted to kind of start this time together by emphasizing some group norms. And so, what group norms is just kind of a set of attitudes and perspectives that we want to really emphasize in this time and space together, and this is particularly to do with the times where you'll be prompted to kind of share your thoughts or perspectives about all the content that we are going to be covering today, how that's landing with you, but also just as you engage and listen and learn in this time together as well. So first, the group norm that we want to start with is to step in and step out. And so this can either be in the conversation that's facilitated in our time together, but also as you're listening about what's been kind of going on for AAPI folks, both historically and more currently as well. And so whether that's in this internal way within your own space, like in your homes or wherever you are joining us from today, be brave in participation and engaged, and know when to kind of respectfully listen, but also when we're in the conversational space, be brave in participating too. I really believe in the power of stories and power of perspective as well. And so that's why we were really intentional about providing some space together today to be able to have that. But yeah, be brave in participation, stepping in, but also know when to step out as well. When we are sharing, please use I statements. So we don't want to make a lot of generalizations about the experiences of others. And so when you are sharing, please again, do it in kind of the first person perspective. And again, respecting others' personal space. And so that's emotional and psychological. We're not sharing physical space together, but again, everyone's going to be probably engaging in the conversation and the content together today in in an individual way. So just being mindful of respect. And when we are, in conversation, to refrain from, right, like, this is what you should do, this is what you shouldn't do. And when it's appropriate, to give thoughtful feedback, and of course to welcome diverse opinions. I think one of the really big strengths of the API community is the vast diversity that we have, and we really want to emphasize and honor that. And so again, with the caveat that there some things emotionally and psychologically might come up for you, and that is totally normal. That actually is what makes learning and engaging in this content really meaningful. But again, this is not a kind of this processing space for all of us. We really want it to be something that's educational, and hopefully, right, also meaningful, but to kind of be mindful that this is kind of not a therapeutic space. Janice, I think you can go to the next one. Thank you. All right, so a big chunk of our time together today will be talking about Asian American history. And so the intention behind this is because, I think a lot of folks, especially from the API community, have felt that, anti-Asian sentiments and, definitely xenophobic sentiments have been around, but there have been not too much discussion or spotlight on the experience of Asian American folks in America, right? And so I think there has been a lot of movement to try to have conversations about race go from this, white-black dichotomy to also including folks that, right, are marginalized and have marginalized identities, including Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. And so I really wanted to hone in on kind of how Asian American and Pacific Islander folks have experienced their time in the US. And so to see kind of where the origination of some of the things that are current might be coming from. So I'm just going to go over this hopefully quickly so that we have more time to kind of share space together. But so from 1765 to about 1800s, Filipino sailors worked as crew or indentured servants on Spanish galleons. So this is kind of the first time that there have been folks from Asian descent that have come to the U.S. The U.S. as we know it. And so they established a Filipino American community right outside of Louisiana, and the folks from this community also actually fought alongside U.S. soldiers in the Battle of New Orleans in the War of 1812. And so there's a lot of misconception that there's just this huge influx of Asian immigrants in the 80s and the 90s, but actually the presence of Asian Americans have been in the U.S. since the 1700s. The next day I want to highlight is in 1848, the transcontinental railroads recruited about 15 to 20,000 Chinese immigrants to work on the railroads from 1848 to about 1855. The reason for this was because white workers denied wanting to work on the roads because of its, dangerous working conditions. There were explosives and a lot of heavy tools, like very grueling work hours. And so by about 1867, when the recruitment had ended, about 90% of this labor force were Chinese immigrants. And, they were given the most difficult and dangerous work because they, also did work alongside non-Chinese, non-Asian folks as well. And they were paid about 30 to 50% less for their work than white folks for the same job, while being required to pay for their own food and enduring a lot of physical and psychological abuse from folks in supervisory roles. And so I wanted to highlight this date because it's really interesting that the derogatory term chink, right? That's something that Asian folks have been hearing a lot, ching chong, along those lines have come from the sound of a hammer and tools hitting the metal, building these roads. And so really wanted to be mindful of also highlighting that, right, even derogatory terms that are used against Asian folks today have a historical root as well, which is similar to other communities of color. The next kind of event that I feel like was significant was in 1854, the People versus Hall case. George Hall, it was a man who was convicted of murder, and there were 3 Chinese eyewitnesses, but the Chinese folks' testimony were disqualified in California specifically, actually, because the state banned testimonials from specific groups. So these were Black folks, Indians, right? And that's how they understood Native Americans. And Chinese were considered as kind of a mix between Native Americans and Black folks. And despite, Chinese immigrants paying about $5 million in taxes via the foreign miners tax. And so this man, George Hall, was acquitted of his crime of murder because the court would not hold up the eyewitness testimonies of Chinese eyewitnesses. The next is in 1862, the coolie trade. Chinese immigrants were trafficked to be used as indentured servants to replace enslaved Black Africans on plantations. And I'm going to try to quickly move through this. The next is the Chinese Exclusion Act. A lot of folks know about this in Asian American history, but this is the first law ever in the US related to immigration, and it restricted immigration from specifically China for 10 years and denied citizenship, even if the entry to the country was accepted, right? An event that a lot of folks don't know is the Bellingham riots, and this was in 1907, and it was inspired by this group called the Asiatic Exclusion League, which is pretty self-explanatory in and of itself, right? But they used some caustic language about being concerned of Asian workers replacing them, and it was the Asiatic Exclusion League was largely made up of white male workers. And so the Bellingham riots was inspired by this group where hundreds of white workers in Bellingham, Washington, pulled Sikh men from Punjab out of their bunks, and they set their bunkhouses on fire, stole their property, and beat them really so badly that many had to be hospitalized. This made the news at the time, kind of as you can see in the picture that I'm sharing with you below. But a lot of workers, there was no prosecution, and workers who did escape, the Sikh men, were rounded up by police and jailed. In 1913 comes the Alien Land Act, where this act deemed aliens, right, so immigrants, ineligible for citizenship from owning land, and limited, even if folks were able to lease land, their lease term was up to 3 years, right? So a lot of kind of gatekeeping and red taping around like who is considered acceptable, right, and being in the US and not. And yeah, aliens included all immigrants from Asia, with specifically this is for folks with specifically the Japanese in mind. And this act wasn't reversed until after World War II. All right, Janice, we can go to the next slide. Thank you. Okay, in 1942, we see the Japanese internment camps, and this is this is a more well-known event in Asian American history, but amidst World War II, President Roosevelt signed an order that anyone of Japanese descent, even those who are US citizens, were to be incarcerated and isolated in camps. And yeah, Japanese Americans were forcibly removed from their homes, forced to abandoned their property, and were incarcerated without cause. The next kind of significant historical event is the Immigration Act of 1965. And this, right, like prior to this act, since about 1790, a person who was an immigrant from Europe, and so someone, right, with more Caucasian related features and Germanic groups were allowed since 1790, but the Immigration Act reversed it and did allow, right, immigrants from Asia to come, but instead the US and the Immigration Act created a system, and this was a system that had 7 categories with preferences for immigrants from relatives and children of citizens in the US, and this is already limited, right, because of previous immigration policies, and professionals with specialized skills. And so this looks like doctors, engineers, lawyers. And so when we think about a really pervasive kind of stereotype for Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders is the model minority myth, right? Where even though, right, Asian Americans and API folks are considered to be non-white, right? They are considered to be white adjacent because of their professional standing, but right, there is a historical root to that too. And the pervasiveness of the model minority myth not only harms the Asian American community, but, I think with the collaboration and connection with other communities of color as well. But again, it has its historical roots because only immigrants from Asia with these specialized trainings were allowed to enter the US. All right. And in 1982 is the famous killing of Vincent Chin. For those that don't know about Vincent Chin, I believe that there is a documentary coming out about him recently, which I'm very excited for. But just a very quick overview. On the night of his bachelor party, Vincent was beaten to death with a baseball bat by two white men in Detroit. The killers, their names are Ronald Ebens and his stepson, Michael Nitz. They were two men that were recently laid off from their jobs in the auto industry. The American auto industry was really declining at this time because of increased competition from Japanese imported cars. And the two assailants, the killers, were targeted Vincent because he looked Japanese. The killers were fined $3,000 for their crime and were released. And the presiding judge in the case had shared, these weren't the kind of men you send to jail. Vincent's family were not allowed to testify in court, and Vincent's last three words before he lost consciousness and eventually lost his life was, "It's not fair." He was buried the day after on what would have been his wedding day. So a very, it kind of takes away from this like whole systemic historical context that we've been talking about thus far to a very individual and painful experience. That middle picture there on this slide right now is Vincent Chin's family. The last historical event that I wanted to share with you is the LA riots. And I know that, I'm speaking to folks, I think from different, areas of the country, but I think most of you are all based in California. But the LA riots were sparked by the police brutality against a Black man named Rodney King. And it was inflamed by, years of racial and economic inequality and police brutality in LA. And when Rodney King was beaten so badly, and I didn't want to include pictures, but it was really difficult, to kind of, as I was also doing my own research, I think it's like sometime in college, it was unbelievable. But the police officers were acquitted who beat Mr. Rodney King. And this elicited rage from the African-American community, and it spilled over to the streets. The businesses that were targeted were liquor stores, grocery stores, retail shops, and restaurants. And it was mostly in an area that is known as Koreatown in LA today. These small businesses were set on fire, looted, and destroyed. Excuse me. And approximately 2,000 specifically Korean-run businesses were damaged, and about $1 billion worth of property was destroyed. Police did not respond, and this forced small business owners to protect themselves. And a really powerful video, and I wish we had so much more time together because I wish I could share some of those resources too. But a lot of them were very appalled. A lot of small business owners were really appalled by kind of the lack of presence from law enforcement through this experience. And because they are immigrants, mostly of Asian descent, I think there was a lot of trust kind of in the justice and equity system of the US, but this was a really rude awakening for those small business owners. And, before I kind of wrap up this section, I wanted to give space for the fact that there's a lot of nuance there. The racial tensions between the Black and Korean community, even before, the beating of Mr. Rodney King was certainly present, but it really seemed like it was this, inflamed reaction. And it was, spurred on by the police brutality that had been really present for communities of color kind of everywhere. All righty. Okay, so I know that I just breezed through that very quickly, But again, we wanted to give a really good foundation about, where some of, even the current anti-Asian sentiments and hate crimes have its roots, right? This is not something that is new. It is not something that is well known, and right. And so there's a lot of debate right now about including Asian American studies on college campuses, but also, in curriculums in K through 12 curriculums. And so I know Florida is one of the states that is taking some actions to include some of the historical events that we've talked about today into their K through 12 curriculum. But a lot, it's kind of a known, I think, for folks that, are identify as AAPI, that we know that these things have happened, and there have, I'm sure the flood of even individual stories for, those of us that are children of immigrants, and we saw our parents, right, be targeted for microaggressions or even true, physical, financial, emotional, psychological harm. Like that is very much a part of how we have experienced even this generation of, being API in America. But again, all of these historical kind of nuances have been left out of, the large conversation, not only about, race and equity, but even right in educational content as well. So we really thought in this training, we wanted to be transparent about what it has been like to be AAPI in the US. And so hopefully that is a good kind of segue into understanding some of the things that are happening in our current culture and climate. Okay, you can go to the next slide, too. Thank you. All right. So, as I mentioned, as history has shown, anti-Asian racism and xenophobia are not new in the, fabric of race and racism of the US. I think some specific statistics that really feel like are important to address is that anti-Asian hate crimes have risen 150% in the US since the pandemic. A lot of commentators and scholars are, kind of drawing this line with the Trump's administration labeling of the coronavirus as the Wuhan virus or the Chinese virus to kind of opening, right, this rhetoric and the floodgates into almost giving credence to, right, scapegoating folks that are that look or are of Chinese descent. And so the statistics make a lot of sense to me in kind of the conversations about COVID that were happening when we were first hit with the pandemic. But it's really interesting that not a lot of people know that cases in the US actually are traced back to travelers from Europe and folks that were traveling domestically. So I think there's, this understanding that yes, the virus, started in Wuhan, and somehow, I don't know really how, but it must have made its way to the US. But the first cases of COVID in the US have actually been traced back to travelers from Europe and in domestic travel. And so on April 28th, 2020, NBC News reported that 30% of Americans personally witnessed someone blaming Asians for COVID-19. And there, this is, we really want to understand these statistics in the context of the prevalence of reporting, right? So some folks will feel comfortable with reporting, but a lot of people won't. And, there's a lot of reasons for that, but a lot of studies have shown that folks from first generation, so, right, like who we imagine to be kind of our aunts and uncles and parents and grandparents, the first generation have been reported to or have been shown to report the least number of hate crimes that they have experienced. And so, we really want to know that, the 30% of Americans like witnessing someone someone blaming Asians for COVID, there is a lot of underreporting that is going on as well. The pictures here, again, just wanted to touch base real quick. I think the woman on the left is pretty well known kind of, in terms of what has been going on in current events. She was beaten without cause by a white man and, stood up for herself and also retaliated. But just really inexplainable pain. And, there have been kind of senseless violence on the streets against AAPI folks as well. And the looting kind of that we were talking about even before have been happening, and that has been contextualized with the George Floyd case as well. And so that, the harm has been, of course, physical, but also emotional, financial, and psychological as well. Okay, we can go to the next slide. Okay. So I think, some examples of other anti-Asian hate crimes have included the murder of a Burmese American family, and this was a father and there was one 4-year-old and one 2-year-old child who were stabbed because and the reason for it has been because it seemed like they looked Chinese. And so, really this connection between what has been going on with the anti-Asian rhetoric of, scapegoating Asian folks for COVID in the US these are the ways that it's manifesting. There have been attacks where acid have been thrown on AAPI folks. They've been beaten and hit with an umbrella or a log. Physical threats and verbal harassment have been very common in anti-Asian hate experiences. And again, so has, vandalism and property damage for Asian businesses. And I think, there's not a lot of conversations or coverage, definitely in the media for this aspect. So the vandalism and property damage, I think there has been some acknowledgement to what has been happening for Asian-owned businesses, especially with COVID, but nearly not as much as I think is, appropriate in terms of, it being covered in the news as well. And, the picture the picture to the left is a man who, one of the men who were beaten as a, anti-Asian hate-related crime, and he recently passed away after being in a pretty comatose state for a while. And then the picture to the right, we know, is very recent, is Michelle Go, who was killed by a man who pushed her in front of a train in Times Square. And so this was a picture of a vigil that was held in her honor, as well as other Asian American Pacific Islander folks who have been targeted for these hate crimes. Okay, yeah, and so just a little bit more of a good capture of the things that have been happening for AAPI folks more at a larger, broader level. This is from the Stop Asian Hate organization, and they're in their national report, they were finding that 1 out of 5 AAPI have shared in 2021 that they have experienced a hate crime. That translates into 4.8 million Asian Americans and 320,000 Pacific Islanders. And tracing back to even the statistic that we were talking about earlier, right, that 30% of Americans have seen or heard or witnessed Asians being blamed or scapegoated for the coronavirus. These numbers, right, makes a lot of sense. And so I think, if you think about the AAPI folks that right, or if you identify as a AAPI person yourself, 4.8 million of us and 320,000 Pacific Islander folks. I think seeing those individual stories and faces, is a really powerful necessity in kind of contextualizing the hate crimes that have been happening in this country. Thank you. And so where are these hate crimes happening? So it's been found that about 31% of violence is happening on public streets. 26.8 is in small businesses. I think this statistic is relevant to the folks that are kind of joining us today. 62% of the hate crimes are against women, and 42.7% of it is towards Chinese Americans. But I also, want to wanted to share that youth who are, so folks that are up to 17 years old have reported about 9.9% of the of Asian hate related incidents, and seniors 61 and older report about 7.1% of the total incidents. And so this is not that, youth and seniors are not experiencing, either verbal or physical harassment or aggression, but, in terms of the sobering realities of who feels empowered enough to report even hate crimes, right? To either like lawful law enforcement, or even to, resources that, really encourage Asian folks to report hate crimes. The most vulnerable population, even the API community, the youth and seniors are reporting, very, very small margins in terms of their experiences. And again, kind of to expand on the last point of the 42.7% of Chinese Americans being ones that reported Asian hate crimes. So out of all the ethnic groups, Chinese Americans were reporting the highest. That was followed by Korean Americans, and that was about 16.1% of hate crimes reported were by Koreans, and then about 9% were by Filipinx folks, about 8.2% were by Japanese folks, and about 7.8% were Vietnamese Americans. And so, right, there is very staggering differences in terms of the percentage of who even really feels like are allowed to report their experiences. But right, like I think this really highlights that these hate crimes are happening across the very wide spectrum and diversity in the Asian American community, right? And that shows us how much connection that we need to be making as a community, and the connection that we are needing from other folks as well who don't identify as API. Because again, that 4.8 million statistic for Asian Americans and 320,000 for Pacific Islanders, that is those numbers and those experiences are happening for across the diverse group, ethnic groups that are under this API umbrella and family. You can go to, okay, this is a good, yeah. And so first, I feel like this is a good space to sit with everything that has been shared so far. I think historically and right, even currently, the experience of Asian American folks, again, haven't been well understood. It hasn't been included in conversations about, race and color and equity. But it, hopefully all the content that has been covered so far has made it very clear that, experiences for API folks have not been, easy in the US, and have been, Asian American folks have been targeted for hate crimes and anti-Asian sentiments, as long as they have been here. And so, there is a lot of strength in the API community and resilience, and, we will get to kind of that topic later, but I wanted to give some space to really sit with what has been shared, that, is a reflection of experiences of API folks here. And again, what feels really important is that there is a healing that happens together and through, collective effort. You can go to the next slide, Janice. Thank you. And this is kind of the first time where I want to move it over to you all. And so I know that's, folks that are joining us, I think there are folks that identify as API and folks that don't. But, first of all, I want to thank everyone that is here that particularly don't identify as API folks that want to learn about our experiences and about how to be helpful. And so, but these questions, I want it to be more general for everybody. First is just kind of checking in. My training is as a psychologist. And so it's always really important to me to be able to kind of gauge the room and, get a temperature. So first, just curious of what's coming up. We're not going to have time for, each and every one of us to share, but again, like the group norm that was shared at the beginning of the presentation, this is, a space where we want to hear from you as well. So we're only going to be able to have time for probably about like 2-3 folks to kind of chime in. But again, really want to encourage you all to do that in a brave but respectful way. So the first question is, just a quick check-in, what's coming up? And the second was anything surprising from what was shared in terms of historical events, as well as some of the current events and the statistics of what's been going on. So I am going to mute myself. And I, because I work as a psychologist, I'm very good with silence. So I am good with waiting. But again, for time's sake, really want to invite you all to engage and participate in this space in a brave and respectful way. Sorry, I should have clarified. I think Janice gave a good example, but if you have thoughts to share and responses to these questions, you can post it in the chat and I can read it out loud and engage that way. So I can read what Janice shared with us while waiting for some more responses. She says, unfortunately, not much is surprising. And while it is hard to hear the numbers, she says she finds comfort in the fact that there are a lot of people here to listen and learn. I think that's a really good point. Again, as was shared at the beginning of the presentation, there is a lot of heaviness that comes with, right, the sobering statistics and even the stories of anti-Asian hate and sentiments that have been historically rooted and are happening currently as well. But yes, I think I really appreciate her point about, right, there are people that are here to learn and listen, and that feels really comforting and safe as well. Janice says, thank you for the data. The numbers are a lot bigger than I expected, sad to say. What can we do to reduce numbers of violence against our communities? Yeah, so a big kind of the latter part of our time together today will be focused on some practical, interventions. But yeah, this was, I think like this space right now is for us to be able to check in with each other. I'm going through the other chat that I think I missed while I was talking. And I'm reading Jason's comment about, other updated articles, specifically in San Francisco. It seems like there was a marked 567% increase in anti-Asian hate. That is really sobering, and the statistic is really difficult. But, I think especially with, this, the population makeup of the Bay and folks in San Francisco, there's a part that doesn't feel super surprising either. Rola shares that they were struck by the Black Korean conflict. This adds a lot to the mix. And yes, certainly. And so I think, the reason why we wanted to be intentional about, saying that, there's going to be a lot that's coming up. There's a lot of nuance, right? but again, I think like these conversations are really important and pivotal in having together across, across communities as well. Heidi says the stories were indeed impactful. I was surprised by her emotional reaction to these stories. She feels like we need to continue having more of these conversations to increase awareness and sensitivity. Yeah. Thank you everyone for sharing. I think, there seems to be kind of this theme, right? There was impact, but there was also surprise, but also, it's not surprising, right? And so I'm hearing and kind of catching that there is a lot of thoughts and emotions kind of coming up in the room. And I think that is precisely a good place to be. I think, right, hearing about these experiences and certainly the historical roots of what it has been like to be API in the US, there is a difficult component. And I think, these conversations can only really be fruitful if we are able to sit also with that heaviness and then move forward to kind of what healing would look like. But I think a big chunk of what healing is being able to sit with the heaviness that also comes with the difficulty as well. All righty. Okay, so Janice, if you can go to the next slide. First, thank you everybody again for sharing. I know that, I really wish we were sharing physical space together so that we can, see each other's faces and hear each other's voices. I think there is a lot that kind of gets taken away when, we're meeting on these platforms, but I for one am really thankful and honored to kind of have heard your responses to what has been shared. And so I know that was a lot of heaviness and difficulty, but we want to move forward to kind of, okay, like what can we do? How can we engage in this, in what's happening and what's been happening for API folks in a practical and helpful way? And so I want to kind of give the caveat, right, that what intervention looks like will be different for those that identify as AAPI, and intervention will look like for those that don't identify as AAPI, right? So folks that are considered allies and who, we are so thankful to kind of have partnerships with that, want to show up for the API community, again, in a helpful way. But again, intervention should look different for folks that are being targeted for racism and racist acts and hate crimes, as opposed to those who want to step in a meaningful way. And so kind of, I think with that, this is the points that I'm sharing today are informed by a pretty well-known bystander, and this is a bystander anti-racism model that is authored by Ashburn Nardo, and it's called the 5-stage confronting prejudice model. But I wanted to kind of make it, bite-sized and condensed so that folks, can take away with these points, and we'll be talking through them as well. So first, the goal is to communicate to someone who is, and this is more in a conversational stance, but it's to communicate a message of disapproval or discomfort without damaging interpersonal relations. So bystander actions are most effective if arousing defensiveness of the offender can be avoided. And I think a lot came up with me when I was reading through this model and reading through what was suggested, because again, the anger that comes up and the difficulty with emotionally that comes up with realizing, right, the experiences of like anti-Asian hate crimes in the US are so valid, and there's space for that. But this is where it looks a little bit different, I think, for folks that are not, that don't identify as AAPI, and to kind of, for those folks to engage in conversations with others who might say, a comment that's xenophobic or, expresses anti-Asian sentiments. And so I kind of wanted to emphasize that this is important work for our allies to do, and would be so helpful to the API community for folks that are our allies to engage in. And so first, how do we go about this? It's to ask the offender, ask the person who is, expressing these sentiments or talking about, carrying their beliefs about anti-Asian sentiments into action, it's first to ask questions rather than to make statements. So, right, like kind of open up a road for conversation. So why do you say that? Can I hear more? Can you tell me more about what you mean? Sorry, everyone, the sun, I live in Georgia, so the sun is kind of coming in my face. But the second is to elicit the offender's pro-social and egalitarian self-image. And so this, I wanted to give a specific example. So it's to, share with them, again, open up this road for conversation, right? I'm surprised to hear you say that, I've always thought of you as somebody that is more, that is open-minded. And I think, right, like by eliciting a pro-social identity for the offender, there can be room to have conversations about why they might believe in what they might believe in. And this, is helpful for conversations about any communities of color or marginalized folks with those that are expressing racist sentiments. And then the third is to share how a comment or, even a joke, what's shared makes you feel, right? And how that landed on you. I think it's really easy for us to be like, oh, right? Like, and just like, oh my gosh, like what? And kind of laugh it off or go about it in a way it's like, I don't want to make a scene, right? But it's really effective to share how and assertively how, a racist comment, an anti-Asian sentiment made you feel as a non-API person, or even as API folks too, right? To be really honest and transparent and say, makes me uncomfortable to hear you say that. And, to kind of really draw this very strong boundary and line of what it, is like what you will allow that person to kind of engage in conversation with you and the topics and how you feel. The fourth is to maintain respect, not a self-righteous approach. And I had to think about this point, a lot too. I think, when we hear about anti-Asian sentiments and hate crimes and all these things, right, that is so painful, especially as an API person. It's hard to maintain respect, right? But I think I read something recently, respect isn't given to those that just deserve it. It's given, by the person who, who is able to give it. And so I think approaching conversations that are charged with racist sentiments or anti-Asian sentiments as well, to extend respect, it again opens up this kind of flood for conversations to happen, for real change, right? Real internal change to occur as well. We can move on to the next slide, Janice. All right, some responses to racism. And some racist comments, microaggressions, sentiments are overt. They're easily recognizable. So, physical, and we'll talk a little bit about physical attacks and verbal harassment as well. But right, some are a little bit more overt or subtle, and right, not as overt. And that, I think this is why trainings like this are really important, so that there can be more of an awareness of what did you just say? What kind of comment did you make? Again, opening up an area for conversation. For leaders in businesses and organizations, it has been found to be really helpful for leadership to make very clear statements that any form of racism, no matter how minor, right? So even again, comments, microaggressive comments are unacceptable in your organizations and businesses. So this explicit expectation that's placed that, right, especially with, all the hate crimes that have been happening currently, that this is a stance that you're making as leadership in your organizations is found to be really helpful for curbing the expansion of racist and race-based comments and attitudes as well. And bystanders who, see somebody do something or say something that, has anti-Asian sentiments embedded within it, they should take responsibility for intervening, reporting, or challenging these offenders, and by contributing to an inclusive and non-discriminatory culture, right? So I think this point is for our allies. The onus shouldn't be on API folks or folks for other marginalized identities, right? This is a collective effort for us to protect each other and to honor each other, and the onus of that protection, I think it is kind of the effort is by everybody, right? And so not just API folks. There is the fourth point is that there is a cost benefit analysis that needs to happen. Business organizations should normalize and prioritize like action versus inaction. I think there's a lot of hesitation in terms of making movement of, saying like, we do not accept, any like racial or discriminatory attitudes or perspectives because of this cost benefit analysis process. But again, it's this very explicit naming of what the organization stands for in terms of racism and discrimination and action and inaction that really makes a difference. Thank you. So all of this I wanted to kind of contextualize in how we can enact these conversations and actions and intentions. First, right, it's important to assess the safety of any situation. And safety can look like physical safety, but also interpersonal safety, right? And so when you see someone being attacked on the street, an Asian person, it's difficult to, I think a lot of ineffective bystander interventions happen because, right, the bystander is really trying to gauge like, okay, is this going to put me in danger, right? And so we're going to talk a little bit about what that looks like to address that. But a lot of times, even when we hear racist or again, anti-Asian comments, I think there's a lack of intervention because folks are really doing an analysis of how this could impact the interpersonal safety that you have with someone or with the offender, right? With the person that are saying or sharing these comments. So by knowing that, right, like that hesitation by being an effective bystander is coming from, right, your gauge of physical and interpersonal safety, determine what actions can be taken. And so, this looks like how to assertively say, that makes me uncomfortable that you said that. I don't agree with what you said. Yes, there can be, this interpersonal maybe lull, but again, to kind of determine what needs to be said and how it needs to be dealt with, I think needs to happen in the context of assessing for safety, particularly with the physical safety aspect. I think, considering what outside assistance is required is important as well. And so I think I also saw this comment in the chat too. But a lot of times, and we even saw in kind of historical context too, the reliance on law enforcement hasn't been helpful or has felt protective. And so I think a lot of times for API folks particularly, I think space and community is really important. And so, right, I think a lot of healing comes from being able to turn to outside assistance, which are other API folks and our allies as well. And more specifically, I think within the context of these 3 points, the next 6 points to the right are more practical things that can be done, right? So name the action as racist, either whether it's a comment or a physical action. Second, support the target of the racist comment or action. So if you hear someone be called a derogatory term on the street, I'm trying to give some practical examples, right? It is even helpful and really healing for the person, the target of the racism, to hear from another person, right? Like, I support you. Like, what do you need in that moment? What action can I take? The third point is to just mobilize support from other bystanders and other authorities. Again, authorities doesn't have to mean police or law enforcement. Although, right, like in physically dangerous situations, I think this law enforcement is a viable option to consider. But again, there's also, I think, community support and resources as well. But I think also support from other bystanders and other allies as well, I think is a really good way to intervene really effectively. The fourth is, again, this point has been covered, but yeah, just disagreeing and assertive interjection actually in and of itself is really protective to the person that is experiencing or is the target of the racist comment or action. Like, this is not right. I don't agree with what you said. And I think especially a person that is not API or is not a person of color stepping in this way is really helpful because again, it takes the onus off of doing what is right. Of the person that is, in the position of being oppressed. The fifth and sixth points have to do a little bit more with what was shared at the beginning, right? So the first four are kind of like in that moment when you're seeing what's happening, but these are more the points 5 and 6 have to do more in a conversational context, right? And so this might be a family member at Thanksgiving dinner that says something that, is racist or anti-Asian in its intentions, and to ask the offender, ask the person who had made that comment to clarify or repeat. And so a lot of times when, there again there is an opportunity for conversation, people will reevaluate what kind of just came out of their mouth. And so again, right, this opens up an opportunity for conversation with people that are sharing these racist sentiments. And again, these points are more for folks that don't identify as AAPI, but can, also be used for our API folks as well. The last point is, I think, having to kind of do with that respect aspect, empathic, confronting someone empathically. I think, us being able to share, like, honestly, the damage and offense that was caused by a racially charged comment, and helping the offender to reflect on their feelings and behavior has been shown to also be a really effective intervention. I am mindful of time, but I wanted to wrap up kind of this time by sharing this video. The API Strong program started it. And so, I just covered a lot of material in terms of, steps, and we'll be sharing a one-pager with you that includes those steps that will be sent out. But again, I wanted to provide some space for us to connect with, with the steps, but with the stories and the strength of community as well. And then we'll have a similar time to what we just did for the community conversation after we watch this together.
Hi, my name is Henry Pineva, owner at MFK Modern Filipino Kitchen in Bellflower.
Hey, what's up, everybody? My name is Dan Nguyen, aka Demon Slayer. I'm a visual artist, musician, composer, DJ, and I also work as art director and curator.
Hi, my name is Ann Lee, Domesthetics Beverly Hills Pomelo USA Inc., its president and the CEO. Thank you so much for coming.
Oh, we serve up that Filipino soul food. So Filipino food for me is about bringing people together, creating experience, and just sharing. And that's what really drawn to me to open up a restaurant.
I'm enjoying the work. I like a pigmentation. We have mostly cosmetic is not just regular cosmetic. We are the fixing, problems, acne and wrinkle and pigmentation like that. So,
I've been drawing since I was 5, and following the arts kind of led me to, different sectors where I was still able to be creative. So
I'm half Filipino, half Guatemalan, first generation here. My mom was born in the Philippines, my dad was born in Guatemala. I feel like for me it's still being defined.
To me, AAPI means that we are fully American, but also with roots in our mother culture. Every individual, we interpret it differently, but I can't separate them. I can't say what is American or what is Vietnamese. I feel like Asian American is just that
but 30, 40 years ago, that kind of world it wasn't there. But this time it's a lot of people trading by the business each other, you know. So I think try to help each other.
Before, I feel like AAPI to me growing up was like kind of a region where I was from, or like a border drawn out on a map, versus now I feel like it's an embodiment of like culture and family versus a region, you know?
You know, I'm here so long, but still I have English problems sometimes. Yes, not the sometimes. Well, that's why they try to talking Korean. They can explain what they want, but me too. You know, I talk to them to English perfectly, but I can't do it. You know, so sometimes we are little trouble there.
You know, our parents, they immigrated here, so they're trying to assimilate to the culture. So I felt like they lost a little bit of that confidence trying to assimilate.
I know so many Vietnamese first gen that don't speak Vietnamese because growing up, the parents were like, you have to learn English or else people will make fun of you, you'll be discriminated against. And even though we learn English, we still discriminated against.
And ironically, that fear of wanting to be accepted, I felt like kind of pushed people away. But I think once we kind of just tore down of trying to fit in is where we kind of started to fit in, you know?
A home means with the family, with the community, and with the labor and safety and peace and love, like that.
At first I thought home was just a physical place, you know, where my friends and family are. But after living in Asia, living in Vietnam for 10, 12 years, I realized that home doesn't have to be one place. And sometimes it's not even a place.
We have it all over the world. And the cool thing is I can go halfway across to the Philippines and feel at home. I can go down to Central America, Guatemala, and feel at home. And that's because of family. And I think for me, that's what home is.
You know, finally, space is kind of like opening up for us to claim.
Over the people, you know, all over the world, the people we have to love. So
I'll say there's too much. Our history is too rich. Our history is too beautiful. The culture is awesome to be ashamed of, you know.
The world is listening more now. And I think it's an exciting time, finally. It's also frustrating it took this long, but that's okay.
All right. Yeah, just a little bit of time to sit with that video. I think it's really powerful because again, it, you know, puts a face and puts three stories to the statistics, to the history, to the experiences, you know, and I think especially, you know, Asian Americans that are in small businesses and, you know, come from immigrant families, you know, most of us do, or most of us are immigrants ourselves. There is a lot of diversity, and that's like beautiful. And I want to highlight the comment that Hafsa shared. You know, they said, I can't imagine living in an environment that isn't diverse. It'd be like living in a two-dimensional world that was monochromatic with no color. And before we get into this second, you know, leg of the community conversation, I want to read a quote. I think that really wraps up the video and, you know, everything that has been shared so far well. It's by Miss Coretta Scott King, and we just recently celebrated MLK Day, but she says, the greatness of a community is most accurately measured by the compassionate action of its members. And so, you know, I think all individuals are worthy, you know, of being known and understood and feeling that they have a sense of belonging. And AAPI folks, you know, who have faced tremendous oppression and I think a lot of, right, these anti-Asian sentiments for so many years certainly are in a time in our recent current history and current events as well, where the action and the compassion of community members, of other API folks, but also our allies, it's a really important time and space for that. So I want to be mindful of time. So unfortunately, we can't share too much, but I still wanted to kind of touch base. So for API folks, as we're wrapping up, I wanted to ask, what is one thing about being an Asian American or Pacific Islander that feels the most meaningful for you? Excuse me. And for our allies, for those that don't identify as API, what is the most significant takeaway that you're getting away from this training and this space together? And again, we can put that in the chat and I'll read it out loud and share it for us as well. Elizabeth shared, as an ally, it's mind-boggling to know that we've not progressed as much as we thought in the US. Yeah, and again, I think as we have mentioned, right, that heaviness and that kind of difficulty with, sitting with what has been shared, I think is important. I think that's a good, space to be. So I actually want to encourage that, right? Because it's from those spaces and those thoughts that I think forward movement can happen, and a lot of advocacy and intervention actions can happen as well. David shared that, yeah, some action steps to halt anti-Asian hate action. Yeah, very, super important. And I think Elizabeth shared earlier in the chat too. I'm, trying to keep track of a lot, but that we'll be sharing those steps in a kind of condensed version on like a one-pager. So for the participants here today. Heidi shared that the most significant takeaway for her as an ally is that silence and inaction is not an option. That's very powerful. She was really encouraged to have specific suggestions to consider for individual intervening actions that can be taken in real world examples. Yeah, and really thankful too that for the bravery, because it takes a lot of bravery to be an effective bystander. But glad that it was helpful. Any others that want to share kind of about community, of what it feels to be Asian American or Pacific Islander that feels most meaningful? Okay, Jason says, as a Chinese American, appreciation for the diversity within our broader API communities, yes, bring great meaning, the depth and breadth of our cultural traditions and heritage. Yeah, absolutely. And, I think the very unique aspect of the API community is the diversity, right? There are, I think, like 60 ethnic groups included in the umbrella of Asian Americans, just the Asian American community. And so definitely want to agree with what you shared, Jason. Thank you. Okay, so just in the interest of time, we can move on. And yes, this will be a time for just Q&A from me. And I know that there was a Q&A toolbar, but I believe that, Elizabeth, are you jumping back on?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you, Hannah.
Okay.
No, thank you so much for this presentation and all the information that we were able to learn today. And we just thank you for allowing us to have this space to be able to learn. I'm sure the audience has some questions for you, so let me take a look at the Q&A box. If you have any questions, feel free to add them in the Q&A section at the bottom. Let's see. We do have one question. It says, how can non-AAPI people or groups effectively advocate against hate towards the AAPI community?
Oh, sorry, my mouse froze for a second, so I was trying to unmute myself. I was like, come on. That's a really great question. And thank you so much for asking that. And I actually did a little like survey myself in my preparation for this training, just like what I wanted to know, like, in an Asian American context, like what do folks want, what does support look like? And so I think the responses that I got for folks in a business setting, right, in either small businesses or even in corporate, I think I think APA folks really appreciate when allies share about their business, right? And so one of the big things about COVID has been that small businesses, particularly Asian businesses, have suffered a lot of financial loss. And I know that has been true for small business owners everywhere because of COVID, right? But I think for API folks, because it's layered also with all these anti-Asian sentiments and hate crimes that are happening with COVID and the pandemic, right? I think so folks were sharing that they would really appreciate if their allies shared about their business, supported their business by, buying its products. And I think that's a really practical way, right? So whether it's sharing on social media or making it a really intentional act to support Asian-owned businesses financially, I think those things are really appreciated, and just highlighting, right, like the beauty and all the diversity that comes with what Asian American Pacific Islander business owners bring. And so even that video, I was like, oh, now I want some Filipino food, and so I think, right, again, supporting API business owners in that way as well. I think, in kind of more of a general sense, I think attending trainings like this, is even it's really the first step, right? To be aware of what has been going on in a historical context, is going on in the current climate, and what moving forward looks like, right? And so kind of building this connection together, sharing conversations like this together, I think is the big first step. And then, right, some of those practical suggestions of how to have more effective conversations if you hear a microaggressive comment, or like in conversation, but also like on the street, right? Like there have been many times where I've heard a lot of things being kind of slurred at me. And, as an Asian American person, and and I've had to have conversations with my friends who are with me in those contexts about what would be helpful, right? Like it would have been really great if you asked me, like, how can you be supportive? How did that make you feel? And I think even those acts of compassion and connection mean a lot and can go a very long way.
Thank you for answering that, Hannah. I have a couple more questions here. One of them touches on like reporting hate crimes or incidents. How can we help to gently encourage, more people to report hate crimes and incidents? It is difficult, most likely, for a victim to want to come forward. So how can we gently help encourage?
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. I think so there's two folds to this that comes to mind for me. I think the first is, numbers do matter. We live in a very data-driven world, and there are several platforms of reporting, but I will share this link in the chat. This is a good one-stop way for reporting hate crime cases. And what I think is very convincing and persuasive is that once the numbers become clear, there is also support, right? So whether that's financial support. So right, when legislators know these are the number of people that are saying that this is a very problematic instance in this country, in the map of this country, right, then there's action. And so I think, right, like kind of saying like, and then there's resources that come with that too, right, with legislators knowing, or there can be policies, there can be funding for nonprofits that support Asian Americans when hate crimes occur. And so I think, right, like trying to be persuasive to like report these things so that others can know, and then there can be like practical, right, support, whether that's financial or organizational, if you want, right, there to be improvement. But I think on the other hand, I think personal stories are really effective and powerful as well, right? So that example that I gave you about me, hearing like a racial slur as I'm just walking down the streets of Atlanta, right? And then if a friend of mine who doesn't identify as API, got something away from me telling her this is what would have been supportive, then there could be, right, these multiple conversations that come, with either API identifying folks or non-API folks that, again, kind of carry this weight and train, and so I think personal stories also have a lot of weight and persuasive power too, for folks to be encouraged to report.
Thank you for that. For the sake of time, we have room for one more question. And this question says, do you think, and if there is, how much is there a class element in the way different Asian Americans are treated? Is it even possible to generalize?
Can you repeat the first part one more time?
Yes. How much is there a class element in the way different Asian Americans are treated?
That's an excellent question. Oh my gosh. And really hard to answer kind of with one sitting. That could be probably a whole different training in and of itself. I think the one, beautiful thing about being API is, again, as we've been talking about, the diversity that is in our community. But like every community, I think there are differences, and class is certainly one of them. There's a lot of misconceptions actually about who is the most well-resourced, or who, what groups are in high or low socioeconomic statuses. So so I can share a link with you. I'm gonna have to kind of dig for it, that differentiates some of the class-related information for different ethnic groups of API folks, but it certainly is true. So South Asians and subgroups of East Asians, like Chinese, Japanese, like Koreans are probably a little bit at the latter end of the totem pole there, which is surprising to, I think, a lot of people, but is statistically true, that are more in the middle to upper class. But Southeast Asians, I think, definitely experience a lot of low income and poverty and and class related difficulties. And so first, I guess I will answer that question in terms of, yes, there are class differences, absolutely. And there are ethnic communities within the API umbrella that are less, I think there's a lot less emphasis on their experiences too. But I think in terms of intervention, I think that part does feel generalizable to me, right? So even though, right, the anti-Asian sentiments about COVID have been because the virus is from China, or right, that's how the Trump administration was labeling it. A Burmese family, right, was killed because of those sentiments. And so, right, there is a generalizability in terms of what does action look like in intervening for all API folks, class or not. But I think it is important to address that there are some of those socioeconomic differences across our community too.
I see. Well, thank you so much, Hannah. Thank you for your insight and your expertise. We've appreciated your time with us today, and for sharing all the information and the resources. So we thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. Janice, could you move on to the next slide, please? Thank you again to Hannah for her insights and her expertise. We've really appreciated the time, and we thank each and every one of you for joining us today. A big thank you again to our sponsors, Verizon, East West Bank, PG&E, and EASE, and our partner, National ACE. Thank you for all of your support and your contributions to this initiative. And thank you to everyone for joining us today. Our next training will touch on Asian American mental health, trauma, and healing. Join us on February 17th at 1 p.m. And our training facilitator will be Hannah Lee again. She will grace us with her presence and her knowledge. But be sure to invite your friends and your colleagues for another very important conversation. We do have several activities and events lined up throughout the first half of 2022. So be sure to stay tuned and look out for our email invites. A quick reminder, today's session was recorded and it will be distributed post-conference. You will also receive the resources, the one-pager, and the slide deck. For any follow-up questions, please contact me at emerced@calasiancc.org. And also we invite you to participate in our AAPI Strong California survey that will be prompted at the end of this presentation. Thank you once again to everyone and have a great afternoon.